I go to fashion school in New York City, so come with me to FIT to do my draping homework.
So I already draped the front of my skirt and marked out my flares and the waist and side seam. So here you can see my 2 flares, which are 6 1/4 inch wide. So then I went ahead and drew out my side seam that I had marked on the dress form. And then at the hip level, I went out 3 1/8 of an inch, which is half the size of my flare, to create the true side seam because there will be a flare on the side seam. And then added 1 inch of seam allowance. So here you can see the first line is the side seam, then the blue line is the true side seam, and then the line above that is the seam allowance. Then I just went ahead and cut off the excess outside my seam allowance, and I pinned it on my dress form to see how everything looks. So I pinned at the center front, the side seam, and the 2 top points of my flares. So here you can see the flares forming. Then I started working on the back of the skirt. So I had to measure out my rectangle out of my muslin and cut that out. And then I pressed the piece of muslin. Then I went ahead and marked 12 inches down, and this is where the hip level is, and it kind of serves as a guideline. And then I needed to be able to see that line on the other side of the fabric, so I used my carbon paper and my tracing wheel to roll that out. So here you can see that there's a yellow line on the back that's in the same line as the pencil line on the front. And I just did the same thing on the front at the hip level. Then I went ahead and put them together, so I had the wrong sides touching each other, and I made sure to line up the hip level for the front and the back, and then I pinned them together. Then I used my carbon paper again to mark my waist point and also my side seam and the true side seam to account for the flare. That way I then had those lines on the back piece, and then I just cut off the excess outside of my seam allowance on the back. Then I folded over my seam allowance on the back and then pinned that along the line for the side seam on the front.
Okay, so I almost finished. I just need to put it on the dress form now and drape the flares on the back. I'm just gonna finish it during class. Stay tuned because I will bring y'all to class later.